everyone, and welcome back to the Social Work Bubble podcast. I'm your host, Laura. I am a licensed master social worker in New York, and today we are talking about suicide prevention, assessment, risk, all of that. We're also going to be talking about some of my own client experiences, levels of care, safety planning. I just want to have a disclaimer real quick that this is a very general overview. This is only one podcast episode, so we cannot possibly get into everything here. I just want to give like a general overview of, as a therapist, as a social worker, some like things to keep in mind when you're working with a client that is suicidal or at risk for becoming suicidal or having suicidal thoughts. I think there is a lot of stigma around people that experience suicidal ideation and suicidal thoughts and have attempted. And one of the myths that's shared even amongst professionals is that if you talk about suicide or risk with a client, that'll make them want to hurt themselves or end their life. And that is simply not true. Many of the people that experience suicidal thoughts, it has no bearing on you bringing it up. A lot of the times they've likely already been experiencing it, and we're just bringing it to the surface, talking about it, and giving them resources and support to move through it. So keep that in mind. Always be mindful of your own biases and your own stuff that you're bringing into the room, because that can really affect how a client feels and their comfort and their vulnerability. Especially around something that can feel controversial and overwhelming. So just keep that in mind. I really hope you take something away from today so we can continue to grow together in this wonderful field. Now let's get into it. So as we start, I'll talk about some very, very briefly, some experiences with clients I've had that are suicidal. I've worked with teenagers, I've worked with adults of all ages that have experienced suicidal thoughts. Many of my clients, I would say the majority, have experienced suicidal thoughts at some point in their life, even if it's not actively while we're working together. Many of my clients, not many, but with the clients that have experienced suicidal thoughts at some point, a big part of our work together is screening for suicide risk and suicidal thoughts, making a safety plan if that's necessary, and then potentially referring to a higher level of care. Each of those things we will get into later in the episode. So we'll kind of watch out for that. With the clients that I've worked with, there have been many, at least ones that are actively experiencing suicidal thoughts. Usually the first step is to assess that risk. Now, there is a suicide assessment that is often given at like an intake session just to kind of see where a client is at. And it is the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, or the CSSRS. All of this and all the resources that we talked about today will also be linked in the description of the podcast, wherever you're listening. So basically there's two parts to this assessment. There's a section on suicidal ideation. Actually, there is three parts. So there's a section on suicidal ideation, the intensity of the ideation, and suicidal behavior. So what's important here is when you're doing this with a client, if this is a form that happens where you're working as like paperwork they fill out before meeting with you, when you actually meet with the client, you always want to follow up on these questions, because there are many people that, because of a lot of the nonsense that has happened in mental health with criminalizing mental health, especially with criminalizing suicidal thoughts and behavior, people don't really feel safe putting that down on paper. So even if they checked no to all of these, you always want to follow up when you're on a call with someone or when you're meeting with them in person to double check and to also normalize it. Something that I always like to tell my clients when we're talking about this, if that's something that ever changes for you, if thoughts do happen if you start to feel like, yeah, I kind of wish I was dead, or I kind of wish all of this would just go away. That's something that they can feel safe in talking to me about. Now, it's important that they're informed. So I do inform them that at some point, if their safety becomes a risk, it is my job to make sure that they stay safe. And I may have to get them into the ER and potentially inpatient care. So that's something that they're all well aware of. I by no means want to lead people on to think it's just going to be fine and that there's going to be nothing that happens. Because I also, it's my job to watch out for them and to make sure that they're staying safe. So that's something that I always talk about. Because of course with clients, we hear all these things all the time about, yeah, I told my therapist I wanted to die, and now I'm in the inpatient unit, and sometimes that's necessary, yes, because sometimes people are at immediate risk of hurting themselves and they need to take a break from the world. But hospitals are also traumatizing, and many inpatient units are maybe not doing the best job that they could. So that's also something where I let clients know, just because you're having suicidal thoughts does not mean I'm sending you to the hospital. It just means we need to talk about it. There are times when, if you are in immediate danger, if you have a plan, if this is something that is very serious for you, like if there's some of these other things that are going on, that is a step that we're going to have to take together. And so I want my clients to be informed, because ultimately, as therapists and social workers, we are working within an oppressive system, and we need to at least inform other people of what they're getting themselves into, for lack of a better phrase, and to normalize that the support is there, but that I also want them to understand like what that looks like, what my role is in that, because that also goes into confidentiality. Like, confidentiality is important, and I will keep that, but if you are a danger to yourself or others, then I have to take action. So all my clients are very, to my knowledge, understanding of that, and we've always been in good places there. And I've had many clients that have then felt comfortable as like treatment maybe continues, or they have a particularly difficult time. They feel open enough to tell me, yeah, I kind of just like don't want to be here. And it kind of gets into some suicidal ideation. So going back to the Columbia Suicide Severity Scale, what this does is, again, it's basically a screening tool. It's something you always want to follow up on. We'll kind of go through it right now. In the suicidal ideation section, there are 5 different parts to it. So basically, the first part is the wish to be dead. There's multiple questions that follow up here, but it's basically like, have you ever thought about being dead or what it would be like? Have you ever wished that you would go to sleep and never wake up? Do you wish you weren't alive anymore? The second question, or the second section, is non-specific, active suicidal thoughts. Have you ever thought about doing something to make yourself not alive anymore? Have you ever had thoughts about killing yourself? This third section is active suicidal ideation with any method, without intent to act, without a plan. So something that's always important in assessing for suicide is that there's ideation, so they're thinking about hurting them, about ending their life, and they know how they're going to do it. They've thought about how they would do it, but they don't have a plan, and they don't have the intent to act. So this would be, have you ever thought about how you would do that, or how you would make yourself not alive anymore? What did you think about? The fourth part of the suicidal ideation section is active suicidal ideation with some intent to act without a specific plan. This would be when you thought about making yourself not alive anymore or killing yourself. Did you think that this was something you might actually do? This is different from having thoughts but knowing you wouldn't do anything about it. That's just good old suicidal ideation. And then this fifth part is active suicidal ideation with a specific plan and intent. Have you ever decided how or when you would kill yourself or not be alive anymore? Have you planned out or worked out the details of how you would do it? What was your plan? When did you make this plan? Was any part of your thinking about actually doing it? If we are meeting with a client and we get to that point, that would, depending on when that happened, because remember, timeline is important, because if a client is filling this out when we are first meeting with them, but this is something they experienced when they were a teenager and they're no longer experiencing it, they're just talking about a past time, then we would not take them to the ER. But if this is something where right in front of us they're saying, yeah, like I know I'm going to kill myself, I want to, I know how, I know when, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to do it, that's immediate risk. At that point, we want to make sure that we get the client into immediate safety, whether that is the client taking themselves to the ER, whether if we're in person with them, we could call the ambulance, we could call the mobile crisis team, we could walk them to the ER if we need to. In moments like this, I do my absolute best to not call 911, because so often they make so many things way worse. When someone is about to hurt themselves, bringing law enforcement into the mix can oftentimes exacerbate the situation and put them even in more harm's way, because if someone is wanting to kill themselves, they know what to do to do that using police as the method, like where they could act in such a way where police think that they're armed and dangerous and they get shot at. So we always want to be careful bringing law enforcement into the mix. But again, sometimes depending on the community we live in, if that's the only resource and the client is not willing or able to get themselves to the ER and the ambulance is apparently unavailable and the mobile crisis team does not do that, I try to use police as the last resort. So this is the first section, the suicidal ideation section. In this screening, what you want to do is you want to ask questions 1 and 2 first. So the wish to be dead. Have you ever thought about being dead, going to sleep and not waking up? And have you ever thought about doing something to make yourself not alive anymore? Have you ever had thoughts about killing yourself? If both of these are a no, then you skip the rest of the questions and you go on to the suicidal behavior section. So if 1 and 2, or more specifically, if the second one is yes, then you continue on. And then you can also do the intensity of ideation section as well. So basically the intensity of ideation is just a client describing how severe their thoughts are. 1 being the least severe, 5 being the most severe, kind of making a description, how many times they've had those thoughts, so understanding the frequency. And then we go on to the suicidal behavior section. So what this is then we're screening for actual behavior that a client has done, including an attempt. So like a self-injurious act with at least some wish to die. A behavior was in part thought of as a method to end one's life. The intent does not have to be 100%. So if there's any intent or desire to die associated with the suicidal behavior, it can be considered an actual suicide attempt. There also does not have to be any physical injury or harm, just the potential for injury or harm. So if the person pulls the trigger while the gun is in their mouth, but the gun is broken, so no injury results, this is still considered an attempt. Some questions in here would be, did you do anything to try to kill yourself or make yourself not alive? What did you do? Did you hurt yourself on purpose? And why did you do that? This question, why did you do that, can feel a little judgmental and direct. Something that could be helpful in those moments is play around with the phrasing. Ultimately, we still want to be direct so we know what's going on. We don't want to bounce around the truth. But even saying like, what was going through your mind during that time? What were you feeling? What influenced that decision for you? Did you fill in the blank as a way to end your life? Did you want to die? Even a little? Or were you trying to make yourself not alive anymore? Did you think it was possible you could have died from this? Or did you do it purely for other reasons, not at all to end your life or to kill yourself, or to feel better, or to get something else? So sometimes a lot of the times, that would be non-suicidal self-injury. Because something to remember is just because a client is self-harming does not mean that they are suicidal. Self-harm is very much a coping skill for many of the people that I work with. We obviously try to approach that from a harm reduction model and try to replace that self-harm with something that is less harmful and allows for more helpful and more healing coping. But just because someone is harming themselves does not mean they want to die. It just means they're trying to figure out how to cope with usually intense feelings and pain. Another section to this is an interrupted attempt. Has there been a time when you started to do something to make yourself not alive anymore, but someone or something stopped you? What did you do? An aborted attempt or self-interrupted attempt. Has there been a time when you started to do something to make yourself not alive, but you changed your mind before you actually did anything? Preparatory acts. Have you done anything to get ready to make yourself not alive anymore? This would be things like giving away items, getting your affairs in order, like meeting with a financial advisor, writing a goodbye note, obtaining the items one would need in order to end their life. So it's kind of that, again, like preparing to end one's life. Actual lethality and medical damage. So this is where, if there has been, this is more for the provider or not for the client to fill out, but if as a result of any of this suicidal behavior, there's been physical harm that's occurred, we want to rate what that has been. So that goes from 0, no physical damage or very minor physical damage, so surface scratches, to 5, which is death. And then this last section here is potential lethality. You only answer this section if actual lethality is 0. So if there's been no physical damage. So again, we're just rating the likely lethality of an actual attempt if there's been no physical damage. So the behavior is not likely to result in injury. The behavior is likely, but not likely to result in injury, but not likely to cause death. The behavior is likely to result in death despite available medical care. So again, these are all questions that are very important to be mindful of when you're assessing for a suicide risk. These are also very complicated questions. So I don't think it's super helpful to just give a client this screening and say, go for it, fill it out. Walk them through it as well. Talk to them about it, because a yes or no checked box only says so much. We want the story. And also keep in mind, like, this is deeply, deeply personal, vulnerable information. If a client does not want to share that with you, do not force them to share that with you. Yes, we care about safety. We want to honor like a client's safety and like their current needs, especially if they are feeling suicidal. But ultimately, this is a client's one of their most vulnerable and private experiences, and we want them to feel respected, especially if this is an initial meeting. Sometimes clients are very comfortable getting into that and they want therapists or social workers to know right away the full story. Other times it's too much for them to get into. So always approach it with compassion and empathy. Make sure the client knows that they're in charge and they're the boss. And if they don't want to go into detail, they don't have to. If they just want to say yes or no and leave it at that, that's fine. But ultimately we want to assess for safety and we want them to be as honest as possible, but also within their own boundaries. Something that is, I think, just a general rule of thumb, because this is a lot of questions, a lot of information to go through. Just keep in mind that we're looking for suicidal thoughts. we're looking for method, plan, and intent. So thoughts, method, plan, intent. A client can have suicidal thoughts. Fine. There's also, within suicidal thoughts, there's passive suicidal thoughts and there's active suicidal thoughts. The difference there is more so almost like non-specific thoughts, or more so like, yeah, I wish I wasn't alive anymore. I wish I could go to bed and not wake up. That's more passive suicidal thoughts. Active suicidal ideation is like, yeah, I want to end my life. I don't want to be here anymore. It's starts to get a little bit more specific and, for lack of a better phrase, more serious. Now, when I say more serious, I do not mean to not take clients not seriously when they have passive suicidal thoughts. Because a lot of research is showing that even clients with passive suicidal ideation, that can flip very easily into active suicidal ideation. So you always want to check in. Something that you also want to be mindful of is when you're working with a client, even if they have never had suicidal thoughts before, look for major stressors, major life changes. If you notice a change in someone's relationship status, financial situation, anything like that, that's a point when you want to go back to this assessment. This assessment doesn't just happen once at the intake session. You're always checking in. And that doesn't mean that at that point you interrupt the client and say, okay, let's go through this screening. No, you check in and you could just gently say, you could validate their experience and say, this seems like an incredibly stressful, overwhelming time. I'm wondering if this has led to any suicidal thoughts, any feelings that you just want this to go away, you just want to wake up, you just want to go to bed and not wake up. And there have been times when I've followed up with clients because I've known their history, or I've known that these are major life changes that are out of their norm, and the answer has been yes. Because sometimes they're not going to bring it up because maybe they don't remember, maybe they don't realize that's significant. It's our job to sift through all of those emotions and all of these different stressors to protect the client and to ultimately keep them safe. So always keep that in mind. A client doesn't have to have a history for us to follow up, especially when there's been major life changes and transitions. So that is, again, the screening tool to assess for risk, but ultimately what we're looking for is suicidal ideation or thoughts, method, plan, and intent. And that's what we want to be mindful of. Now, at what point do we create a safety plan? So usually with clients, I create a safety plan at the drop of a hat. It doesn't take much for me to create a safety plan. The only times when maybe I wouldn't is if a client had experienced suicidal thoughts in the past, many years ago. If the suicidal thoughts were recent or more severe, or they recently became more severe, or they've been dealing with the suicidal thoughts for a long time, even if it's not followed by any method or plan or intent, I make a safety plan. So for me, all I need to make a safety plan is suicidal thoughts. But again, that can depend on the context. If it's passive suicidal thoughts, I may not do a safety plan depending on the client and their situation. But that's also a space where I let them know if this is something that progresses, like, then we will safety plan, we'll do all this. I still don't leave them with nothing. Like in those moments, even with passive suicidal thoughts, we still provide resources, still give them the hotline number 988, which is the suicide hotline number. You could give them the local urgent care facility, local resources too that are available. Maybe the local crisis line, the mobile crisis team, the text line if people are more comfortable texting. Depending on your work boundaries and hours, you could give them like your work information. Because sometimes, I've had plenty of clients where I let them know if things worsen, if you need to meet for an extra session, or, we're kind of in a crisis moment and you feel it'd be helpful to talk, just email me. And if I'm able to, then we can arrange a time to meet. Because we want them to know that we're there for them, but we also want to keep our own boundaries. So it's a fine little dance that we do. So just keep that in mind. So that's the screening assessment. Now with this safety plan, so like I said, I usually create a safety plan for most things, most situations. When it gets to more severe or frequent passive thoughts, or we start getting into active suicidal ideation, that's when I'm a lot more diligent about a safety plan. And what this entails is, you can just Google safety plan. I do also have a bundle of safety plans on my Etsy shop at etsy.com/shop/the social work bubble. And that includes just a safety plan for kids, for teenagers, for adults, just in a way that kind of looks and feels better for each of those like age cohorts, but all the information is the same. So in step 1 in a safety plan is we have the warning signs. And again, once we're creating a safety plan, this is a collaborative effort with a client. So we want to do this with them because this is their experience. They are the expert of their experience. And we want to also get their brain working on what resources are there. If we just tell them everything, they're not going to think of it when they need it, so this also gets their brain moving in. What supports do I have? What resources are available that are realistic for them? So step 1, warning signs. This could be thoughts, images, a particular mood, a situation, a behavior that a crisis may be developing. So it could be different triggers. I have an example safety plan here that I've worked on, and for this particular person, there was negative thinking spirals or intrusive thoughts. They were maybe inconsistent with medication or other preventative habits, and they started to have a desire to feel pain. So these were their warning signs that a crisis may be developing. Step 2 is internal coping skills. So these are things that the client can do themselves as a distraction, to regulate, that is doing it on their own without contacting another person. This could be things like listening to music, like making a playlist, reading a comfort book, writing, changing their environment. So going to a friend's, walking outside, going to their favorite place, a museum, any place that feels good. Hold ice cubes or uncooked rice. These are often used for people that also self-harm. You can also use massage tools, like give yourself a nice massage, kick a ball. 'Cause a lot of the times, if we're dealing with these really upsetting feelings and thoughts, we just want to get it all out. We need coping skills that match the intensity of what we're feeling. So sometimes taking deep breaths or going for a leisurely walk doesn't feel like it matches what we're feeling. So we want to do things that aren't harming ourselves, but feel like it meets that intensity. So like kicking a ball really hard, screaming into a pillow. It could even be using a pillow to hit something. Like maybe it's getting in a pillow fight. Who knows? Ripping up pieces of paper. Throwing paint on whatever works for you. Things like that can help us regulate on our own. Step number 3 is listing people and social settings that provide distraction. So this includes, it could include friends, it could include family, and any places that are comfort places. Now with this, we want to provide as much information as possible, because we have to keep in mind that when we are in a crisis moment, we're not going to be wanting to just dig through all this extra information. So having all the information that we need in one place at our fingertips is the point of a safety plan. The point is so that we don't have to do any extra work. So if you put down the name of someone, try to put their phone number, is something like that. A place, you could put down the address. You could have it saved in your Google Maps folder. You could create a label that says, like safety plan places, and just put in your favorite places that you could go to. Make things as accessible as possible. Step 4 is people that the client can ask for help from. This is different. So step 3 is people and places that provide a distraction. Sometimes the people that provide a distraction may not be safe or comfortable for the client to ask for help from. So sometimes that could overlap, right? But depending on the relationship, maybe they don't feel comfortable getting into what they're experiencing. So we want to try to find friends, family members, any other people in their life that they would feel comfortable asking for help from. This could, again, range from family members, friends, spiritual leaders, mentors, maybe even a professor, like anyone in that client's life that feels like that they could offer them some support that's helpful. Step 5 is professionals or agencies that I can contact during a crisis. This is where I put my work information. So I put my name, my phone number, and my email. Now, I do not put my personal number. I have a Google number that I use, and at the end of my workday, I shut the notifications off of that, and I let my clients know that. I also always give a disclaimer, like, I try to respond as fast as possible, but especially if it's on the weekend or outside of like the time that I'm working, I'm not really checking my email that much because that's my time. And so I just ask them to give me some grace in responding if it's mostly out of like on those off times. I also put in local urgent care services or the local hospital, the suicide prevention lifeline. Here in New York, we also have NYC Well, which provides their own crisis line and chat services, and also a mobile crisis team. So there's a lot of support there. Step 6 is making the environment safe. So typically what that means is, as we remember from the screening assessment, is method. So if a client has access to a weapon, they are more likely to end their life or try to end their life. So we always want to be cautious of what is in the home. If you're working with teenagers, this is a part where you want to triple check what weapons are in the home. I mean, we're all familiar at this point in the United States that guns are everywhere all the time. And many teenagers, honestly, many suicidal teenagers, their parents that are gun owners could be all about gun safety. They could be all about, lock it up, keep it safe. There are so many parents that do not realize that their teenagers know the passcode. They know how to get the gun out of the safe. They know exactly what they need to do. This is information that we have to have. And it doesn't have to be as severe as that. There are some points when a client is experiencing suicidal thoughts, and it could just be getting items that could trigger something out of sight, out of sight, out of mind. For a particular person I was working with, it was making sure all the belts were put away, because if we couldn't see them, we're not going to think about using them. Any sharp objects, if it's someone that's living with their parents, it's easier to lock those things up because the parent can then access them. If they're maybe living with a roommate that's really supportive, that could be helpful, or a partner. There are some things where we want to lock up medications if that's possible. But some clients obviously need medications as part of their treatment regimen. So it's also just about putting things in a safe location. Again, like out of sight, out of mind. But sometimes it's also helpful. Like, we'll put the medication locked up so that way if we're feeling suicidal, it creates a barrier of entry, right? So we still have to unlock it in order to get it. And in that can make a big difference in terms of a client rethinking what's going on. So we're just trying to set up as many barriers as possible to clients actually accessing things that could be used to hurt themselves or end their life. A part that I always like to include in this section in making the environment safe is to go a step further and to make their space comfortable and nice to be in. Because we have to remember, like, many of our clients that are suicidal are also experiencing depression. And many people that are depressed their living situation may not be great, or our living environment may be a reflection of our mood and how we're feeling. And that just does not help when we're feeling low and when we're wanting to end our life. So trying our best to like make the space your own, paint the walls if you want to. It could also be a fun like coping skill and distraction, just to create this space that feels as safe and comfortable as possible. So that way it can be kind of your own place to go to when you need it. So that's creating a safety plan. Again, like, you always want to talk about this with clients, really go through as thoroughly as possible, like what works for them. Now, in doing all of this, because we kind of jumped right into screening tools and safety plans, I will say, before doing any of this, what we want to do first is using empathy and compassion to explore a client's feelings and suicidal thoughts and to validate their experiences. This does not mean that we're saying, yeah, it makes sense that you'd want to die. Like, we're not saying that at all. Honestly, for some clients that might be validating, but I don't think that'd be super helpful to say. But we're validating their experience. Like, we could say some version of that where it's like, yeah, I mean, it's understandable that you're feeling this way. I mean, because I'm looking at all these stressful things that are going on for you and it's overwhelming. So we're really just coming back to the feelings. We're trying to label the feelings that are going on, and we're also trying to validate the client's experience, because we have to remember, I think for many people, even as professionals, we can get triggered. Like, we hear a client is suicidal and we want to go into that solution mode and protection mode of, oh, they're suicidal, they can't die. I don't want them to die. What do we have to do? And so we end up jumping right into screening for risk, right into safety planning, right into all this problem solving before we actually even understand what's going on, and before we even talk about it with the client. Like, what do they think about this? What has been their experience with all of these feelings? It must be overwhelming. So we always want to hold space for really validating the client's experience, and to even, we could thank them for their honesty and for their courage to be vulnerable in that moment, because it is hard to verbalize those feelings and those experiences. And the fact that they were willing and able to do that is a huge milestone. So we always want to enter with no judgment and with empathy and with compassion and with a curiosity. We want to understand them. We want to understand their story and their journey and what these thoughts look like for them, what they mean to them, because all that will go into the preventative work and the planning and all of that. So just remember, before jumping into planning, before jumping into screening for risk, talk to the client first. We are a human, person-centered career and field. So we can't just jump to all the paperwork. Talk to the person that's in front of you first. And kind of just, again, talk to them as a human before we jump into this very, good and helpful clinical side. But just be mindful that we don't jump too quickly into that. Now, this last part that we'll be getting into today, just because we're taking up a lot of time, is the levels of care that are available. So I just recently did an Instagram post on the different levels of mental health treatment, and this kind of goes into that. So this is obviously a very general outline of the levels of care that are available to clients. But first, bare bones, we have support groups and peer support groups. With that, it could be at the same time or on its own is medication or psychiatry. The next level is outpatient care. Then the next level could be specifically with people that are experiencing depression, intensive outpatient care. If clients have been in treatment for a while before and have had no success with treating their depression, it could be a treatment-resistant depression group that offers a more specialized medication or different kind of treatment. That would be something like ECT or ketamine or something like that. A bump up from that would be intensive outpatient care. A bump up from that would be partial hospitalization. And a bump up from that would be an inpatient program. So typically, I think most people are practicing in an outpatient setting. I'm at a private practice. I equate that to an outpatient setting because usually I meet with clients on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. Once it gets to intensive outpatient care, that's when someone is, they're not staying. They're not like a resident at a facility. They're able to leave the facility. But they're going multiple times a week. And usually with that, they're also getting medication or psychiatry at the same time. Partial hospitalization is like a formal program that you have to be referred into. So if you're a client listening and you're interested in that, you talk to your therapist because usually it's the professionals that have to refer. It's very difficult for a client to get access on themselves to those programs. Partial hospitalization, it happens in hospitals, and that is kind of in between outpatient care and inpatient care. So there's many people that have been in inpatient care, which is actually being admitted into the hospital and having to stay for a period of time. Usually inpatient care can be a week to 2 weeks, and then they try to get you into another kind of program from that, whether it's time to go home and you're in outpatient care, whether you're just going to the partial program, whatever that looks like. So the partial program includes support groups, group therapy, individual therapy, and psychiatry. A partial program is something that happens, I want to say multiple times to most weekdays, for a few hours a day. So it's more intensive, but that's the point. It's called partial hospitalization because you're kind of partially hospitalized. You're not staying overnight at the hospital, but you are there pretty frequently for multiple kinds of care. So again, it's with individuals, it's with groups, and you're also getting psychiatry. The inpatient program is essentially the same, except you are staying there overnight and you are supervised. An inpatient program is more short-term than a partial program. So a partial hospitalization program can last for, I want to say a month to a few months. An inpatient program is usually only a couple of weeks at most. Once someone is, an inpatient program is typically for those that were at immediate risk of hurting themselves, and it doesn't have to be just about suicide or harming themselves. Many people that they just have more intense mental health symptoms at that time that need extra support and supervision. So with an inpatient program, you are constantly supervised. There's always people there. You have your own room that you stay in. Sometimes you might have to have a roommate depending on the hospital and the situation. So those are the levels of care. Usually when we're talking about clients that are at risk for suicide, at that point, if the client is an active risk, they have intent, they have all this stuff, what we first do is we get them to the ER. And at the ER, they'll be in the psychiatry unit, and they will talk to the psychiatrist and the social worker, and they will be assessed. They'll do the same assessment that we're talking about now, and they'll make a decision there on whether that person is in need of being admitted to the hospital, which would mean admitted into the inpatient unit, or they are released. Because there are some people that go to the ER and they just need to stay there overnight and then they can go on. A lot of the times though, sometimes that's out of your control, because there is such a thing as, mandatory, is it mandatory? I can't remember the word I'm thinking of, but it's basically like if a client is at risk enough, they don't necessarily have to consent in order to be admitted into the hospital. So that's something to be mindful of. But usually with the clients I've worked with, the first thing I do, and that we've talked about, is we get them to the ER. There's been a couple that I've worked with that I've ended up staying in the inpatient program. I've had a couple in a partial hospitalization program. Usually what happens, in my experience, is the ER is first, and then if they feel the client is still a safety risk at that point, they'll be admitted into the inpatient program. While they're in the inpatient program, I will remain in contact with them because that is only a pause in treatment for a couple of weeks, and we want to collaborate and consult with the hospital staff and with the psychiatry unit, so that way when they're discharged, they have a smooth transition out of the inpatient unit. We could also collaborate with their discharge plan on extra supports and resources. They could continue to see us. We could also, depending on like the therapist or social workers, like boundaries or like own just like professional, what's the word? Like what they're comfortable with treating. Sometimes that's transitioning them to another kind of program. So I've had clients before where they leave inpatient care and they go to a partial hospitalization program. And so they're getting the therapy and the psychiatry and the support groups. And I continue I consult with the professionals that are with them. And then once they're discharged from that program, we continue our work together. So it depends. Again, these are different levels of care. So I always want to be as informed as possible with the client's consent, of course. And usually at that point, they're all they're very consenting. Like they want me to be involved because they don't want to be there. They're just there so they stay safe. But the goal is to eventually get them back to like their regular therapy regimen. So we also want to be consulting with their psychiatrist. If they have a psychiatrist that, before going into the hospital and you have the client's permission, you want to consult with them. That's also something where after a client is discharged and they continue their care with you, that would be a good time to get the client's consent to consult with the psychiatrist. Anytime there's a safety risk or the client needs more intensive treatment, it's always important to check in with the other professionals involved in the client's life, so long as the client consents to it. So just be mindful of that. There's many different levels of care. Like I said, my typical rule of thumb is we get them to the ER for immediate safety needs. And at that point, it's the hospital's job to kind of assess for further risk. It's also our job to advocate for our client. If we feel like the hospital did not do their due diligence and our client is still at risk, we can get them to another hospital. We can advocate for them via a phone call, whatever we have to do, and let them know the severity of what's going on. Again, with client's consent, but with something like with a safety issue, that's also where confidentiality kind of goes out the window a little bit. So again, we always will just want to be open and honest with clients as much as possible, get their consent even if we don't technically need it for safety issues, because it helps them feel empowered and in charge in a time when it can be really scary and overwhelming. So this is kind of everything that I wanted to touch on today. Keep in mind, this again was a very general overview of assessing for suicide risk, safety planning, validating the client's experience and feelings, and then when to refer to a higher level of care. I'm sure we'll have more episodes in the future getting more into like personal experiences, like maybe even highs and lows of working with a client, what things have worked, like what specific clinical interventions have been really helpful. But for today, this is just more a kind of a general understanding of what this can look like in practice. So please let me know your thoughts and your own experiences in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and follow the podcast. All the information and resources that we discussed today are in the description. And thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next time.